Yes, consent is very important before we go on for a VBAC. When to take it, how much to take it, what all should be written in the consent and in which language. And because to save ourselves from the medical legal cases, I invite Dr. Chitra Setia. I know her since my MBBS days. A very, very intelligent and a humble person. And today she is heading the Department of Obs and Gynae in Apollo Group of Hospitals, Noida. She is the founder secretary of Noida Obstetric and Gynecological Society, and she has been the president twice for the same society. She has been a faculty member for numerous national and international conferences, and her special areas of interest is high-risk pregnancy, surgeries of all kinds, and medical legal cases. I welcome Dr. Chitra Setia, and she will be guiding us how to take the consent for VBAC. Welcome, Dr. Chitra.
Thank you. Okay. Which I think is a very important aspect of today's practice, because we are all into some form of medical legal issues. Neha has presented the total first part of my presentation already, so it's been very nice that she has done all this part. So as gynecologists, we all know when to approach a patient for a VBAC. So I'm going
Dr. Chitra, I will like you, in repetition will be good. Because
after a previous LSCS, women who've undergone a previous cesarean delivery have the option of proceeding with a TOLAC, which is a trial of labor after cesarean, or a PRCD or an ERCD, which is planned repeat cesarean delivery in a subsequent pregnancy. Planned TOLAC may result in labor with a vaginal birth, and that is a VBAC, or an unplanned intrapartum cesarean delivery, which is said to be slightly more dangerous than a planned cesarean. Now, what are the benefits of TOLAC? Avoidance of the potential adverse outcomes associated with repeat cesarean delivery, especially multiple repeated cesarean deliveries. Because nowadays we find that the number of cesareans, if they're increasing, you find the incidence of placenta accreta and increta are very high. And there are lots of patients coming in. We never saw so many in our senior residency times or the times we were in Lady Harding. The disadvantage is that intrapartum cesarean delivery becomes necessary at times, which is associated with postoperative infection or uterine rupture. Benefits of the ERCD, PRCD, whatever term you may use, derive from avoidance of the potential adverse outcomes associated with TOLAC. Now, maternal outcome, Neha has already put it. What are the maternal outcomes associated with either of these is uterine rupture, infection, peripartum hysterectomy, pelvic floor disorders, conveniences of elective cesarean. Neonatal outcomes, perinatal mortality and neonatal mortality are marginally higher for TOLAC than for a PRCD. Whereas transient tachypnea of the newborn, TTN, which is quite irritating for the neonatologist at times, is more with elective cesarean rather than with TOLAC, because any vaginal birth decreases the incidence of TTN. Other rates of suspected and proven neonatal sepsis are higher for TOLAC rather than an elective cesarean. Coming to antenatal counseling, Neha has already pointed this out, that it should be documented in the notes. We are coming to that predominantly. A final decision for mode of birth should be agreed upon by the women and members of the maternity team before the expected planned date of delivery. This is a very important point. You have to start this counseling and this decision making after the 36 weeks before she comes into a spontaneous labor, or we have to plan it. When a date for LSCS is being arranged, a plan for the event of labor starting before the scheduled date should be documented in the notes. This is again very important. I hope all of you are scanning your OPD notes and there is some record of this. The routine use of VBAC checklists during antenatal counseling should be considered, as they would ensure informed consent and shared decision-making in women undergoing VBAC. A patient information leaflet should be provided with the consultation. I'll come to the information leaflet. We've been following this in Apollo for quite some time. I think when we were in Max, we started following this. The risks and benefits of planned VBAC versus LSCS from 39 plus weeks of gestation. Women should be aware that a successful VBAC has the fewest complications, and therefore the chance of VBAC success or failure is an important consideration when choosing the mode of delivery. Planned VBAC is associated with an approximately 1 in 200 or a 0.5% risk of uterine rupture. See, planned VBAC means you've made the decision properly, as Neha has pointed out, all the points to be kept in mind before you plan and suggest a VBAC. Absolute risk of birth-related perinatal death associated with VBAC is extremely low and comparable to the risk for nulliparous women in labor. A repeat CS is associated with a smaller increased rise of the risk of placenta previa and of accreta in future pregnancies, and of pelvic adhesions complicating any future abdominopelvic surgery. We have found there's a higher incidence of ectopic scar. Ectopics, it's quite common. People who come for a medical abortion after a previous cesarean, you find there is a higher risk of retained products of conception. These are things we never thought about earlier, but considering the number of first cesareans, you find all these have increased. Risk of perinatal death with repeat CS is extremely low, but there is a small increase in neonatal respiratory morbidity when CS is performed before 39 weeks of gestation, but this can be decreased with antenatal steroids. Now, what are the factors which determine VBAC success? Women should be informed that the success rate of planned VBAC is 72 to 75%. Women with one or more previous vaginal births should be informed that previous vaginal delivery, particularly previous VBAC, is the single best predictor of successful VBAC and is associated with a planned VBAC success rate of 85 to 90%. Previous vaginal delivery is also independently associated with a reduced risk of uterine rupture. Intrapartum management, Neha has again pointed all this out. Planned VBAC should be conducted in a suitably staffed and equipped delivery suite. It should not be a very high-level hospital, but you should have an OT in hand, you should have an anesthetist on hand, so that you can run and get everything done. There should not be that the anesthetist is on call, he's about half an hour away or 40 minutes away, and you lose very precious time. Women with an unplanned labor and a history of previous cesarean delivery should have a discussion with an experienced obstetrician to determine the feasibility of VBAC. Epidural analgesia is not contraindicated in a planned VBAC, though the increasing requirement of pain relief in labor should raise awareness of the possibility of an impending uterine rupture. Frankly speaking, in my so many years of practice, I have not advised epidural analgesia, because one of the first signs of uterine rupture or impending uterine rupture is a sudden increased tenderness at the level of the site of previous scar. So where the woman is under epidural analgesia, these findings, these early findings are missed out. So I do a lot of VBACs, but I never give epidural analgesia for any case of VBAC when I'm doing it. You can give her Entonox, you can give her Phenargan, you can give her any other mode of analgesia, but not an epidural. I mean, that is this thing, though the guidelines say you can give it. Women should be advised to have continuous electronic fetal monitoring for the duration of planned VBAC, commencing at the onset of regular uterine contractions. Now, induction or augmentation. This again, the guidelines say you can induce, but again, prostaglandin should never be given. I don't. Even Dinoprost gel, I don't use it. Maximum I use is Syntocinon, because that is something you can shut off immediately and take some action immediately. Now, women in special circumstances, uncertainty about the safety and efficacy of planned VBAC in pregnancy, complicated by post-age, twin gestation, fetal macrosomia, antepartum stillbirth, or a maternal age of 40 years or more. Here again, you have to individually assess every patient. Like say a twin gestation, we have delivered, twins as a VBAC. If the first twin is right there, she's coming labor, the first twin, the head is right there. You don't need to do a cesarean in those cases. You can plan a vaginal birth. Similarly, antepartum stillbirth. Here again, I definitely assess the patient, because you don't want to give her another scar with no right effect and no right gift to the patient. So here, if the baby size is small and shrunk, I do try for a VBAC. A cautious approach is advised if VBAC is considered in such circumstances. Women who are preterm and considering the options for birth after a previous cesarean should be informed that planned preterm VBAC has similar success rate to planned term VBAC, but with a lower risk of uterine rupture. Only thing is, a very preterm baby may not be able to bear. You have to think of the baby's condition. How preterm is it? Will they be able to bear the trauma of a normal birth? Scar thickness, Neha has already pointed out, anything between about 3 to 3.5 millimeters is associated with a very low risk of uterine scar separation. Now, this is the informed consent form we have in Apollo. I think most of you have a similar consent form, and it's very, very important here. One, listed risks and complications are not all inclusive. And secondly, details of the risk and complications are present in the patient information literature. Now, we do hand over a patient information literature. Ideally, it should be handed over after the last cesarean, after the last ultrasound you do at around 36 weeks. When you've assessed the patient is going to go for a VBAC or going to go for a planned cesarean. So I'll show you what patient literature we give. Here, the only things mentioned are the uterine rupture, placental problems later on, need for blood transfusion, and maternal complications, including coma and death, which could be due to hemorrhage or due to anesthesia. And any patient-specific risks are mentioned over here. And we take the whole detailed things. Now, this is the patient information leaflet, which ideally should be given. And here, what I've mentioned is an expected date of delivery, and we should give the date of receiving the leaflet. Ideally, this leaflet should be given in advance so that they have time to go through this leaflet, see what are the questions they have to answer. I'll go through this with you so that you all can see what is written on it. And we take the signature of the name, the witness, and if required, an interpreter. Right now, we have it only in English. I have just told Apollo to get it translated into Hindi also, so that we can give them a Hindi booklet also for people who are not familiar with English. Now, these are the things we've written down. This is the RCOG guidelines. What are my choices for birth after one cesarean section? The reason to have the cesarean, whether you've had a previous vaginal birth, whether there were any complication, the type of cut that was made in your uterus. Nowadays, a lot of people do have an idea about the type of cut, but not necessary. How you felt about your previous birth, how much, felt about means most people are worried about the complication they've had. So to some extent, you can assess if she had infection, how long was the recovery time, all that will also give you some information about the type of healing which may have occurred. Whether your current pregnancy has been straightforward or whether there have been any problems or complications, how many more babies are you planning to have in future? The risks increase with each cesarean section. So if you plan to have more babies, it may be better to try to avoid another cesarean section if possible. Then what is VBAC? What is an ERCS? That is elective planned repeat cesarean section. Then what are my chances of a successful VBAC? After one cesarean section, 3 out of 4 women with a straightforward pregnancy who go into labor naturally give birth vaginally. A number of factors make a vaginal birth more successful. These are the factors given. What are the disadvantages of VBAC? When is VBAC not advisable? What are the advantages of ERCS? What happens if I go into labor if I'm planning a VBAC? What happens if I do not go into labor when planning a VBAC? What happens if I have an ERCS planned, but I go into labor? So most of the questions have been dealt with. So you tell the patient that you go through the forms and you go through this leaflet, and whatever clarification you need, please come and discuss it with our next OPD procedure. And ideally, you should have this form signed by the patient and attached along with your VBAC form when the patient gets admitted for labor. Now coming to consent form, take the patient's signature or initials on every page of the consent form. Record specifically the name of the doctor or nurse who has obtained the patient's signature on the consent form. Ideally for this, it should be a doctor only. Fill the consent form in legible handwriting. Avoid using abbreviations. See, normally like in Apollo, in our labor room, we have these stand made. Every consent form is stacked up over there. So nobody has a problem finding out where to take out the consent form and get it signed. Now, risk information is very, very important. Explain and record the most commonly occurring risks in consent. All risks having a probability of 10% or more must be specifically spelled out to the patient and duly enlisted in the consent. The exact percentage need not be specifically mentioned. Now, in non-emergency situations, explain in the language or dialect understood by the patient. In case a translator or interpreter have been taken, the translator or interpreter must also sign the consent as a witness. Give the patient reasonably enough time for giving consent after counseling, except in emergency situations such as cesarean. Now, in case of emergencies, do not wait for consent in emergencies if it could be detrimental to the patient. Proceed with life-saving treatment or surgery by taking oral consent of the patient, and appropriate cases even without a consent. Say you have a rupture uterus and all the relatives are out and away. Then in such cases, what do? Take a proxy consent if the relatives or attendants present at that point in time, or even from another doctor, the MS or the head of the hospital. Duly inform the hospital authorities. Record specifically in the patient's medical records and or the consent form the life-threatening emergency, as well as the reasons for not obtaining consent or for obtaining a proxy consent. I'm not saying that at that time you should be writing all this. This is immediately post-procedure. Deal with it, but make sure you have all these records intact before you get out of the hospital. This exercise can be done even once the emergency is over. Now, if there is a delay or refusal to consent, record specifically in both the consent and the medical records if there is any delay, failure, hesitation, unwillingness, refusal, or dissent on the part of the patient to give consent. I have seen so many times the fetal heart is dropping to 80. You've shown the NST to the patient. They say, no, madam, wait karo, abhi wait karo. I've had my case sheet every 10 minutes. I have the record put, I have the NST recorded, attached over there, and said patient has refused to give a consent. If they give a signature, fine, but usually they don't give a signature in such cases when they're refusing. Now, documentation. This is the most important part of any consent. Poor records mean poor defense. No records means no defense. The legal system is not going to ask you what were you doing over there. They just say that we look at notes and we look at documents. The legal system relies mainly on documentary evidence in a situation where medical negligence is alleged by the patient or the relatives. A properly written operative note can protect a surgeon in case of alleged negligence due to operative complications. Detailed notes the SOAP pattern, that is subjective, objective, assessment and plan. Procedure, surgery notes. Be objective, not vague. Be very clear in what you are writing. Don't cook up, don't change. Write an addendum instead. Don't put a whitener and try to hide off things. Cross it and say this is the change. Doctor's notes and nurse's notes must tally. In any emergency case, please ensure this. Sometimes you find the nurses have, automatically written down BP 120/80. Here the BP was 90/60 or 80/50. Give rational, reasonable explanations. Document the communication and communicate the documentation of communication. This is what I tell you that, what I told you, that if the fetal heart is very low, tell them that you're writing it down over here, that you have refused and you're writing it down over here. Don't lie. You don't have to remember the truth. Thank you.
A wonderful presentation, Dr. Chitra. It was absolutely marvelous.
Wonderful, absolutely wonderful, really.
I want to share one thing that whenever you, this is a very important point which all of us should remember, that while doing a first cesarean section, we should write down every detail of the type of cesarean, discharge ticket, at what dilatation you did a cesarean and where was the head and what was the actual condition of that time, whether she had a good contextual